So ACES in the image interchange framework started with a very simple concept. Someone had a piece of film, and they brought it to 2 different places to have scanned, and they walked out with 2 different looking files, 2 very different looking files, thinking of, hey, since my scan is supposed to be related to density, why are these not matching? And they went to another lab and another lab, and they realized that for something that's supposed to be based on density, nothing matches up. The question was like, well, why is this? And the answer was Cineon. Cineon was a custom spec developed by Kodak, which a lot of people reverse engineered, but Kodak never released what Cineon actually was. So everyone was doing their best approximation of what they thought Cineon could be. And it really brought out that one of the problems that we had in motion picture production quite some time ago was the fact that most of movie production was based on secret technologies that were held as closely defined IP, and when companies went away or projects went away, such as Cineon did, it really left a hole where there was no way to get around it. It's just everything became different and fragmented, and movie production didn't work like it was supposed to. So ACES has been a long time in development, and then at each stage of development, there were different parties involved in its creation. The very first step, there were visual effects houses and film scanning. Then camera manufacturers and the ASC got involved. Once that was done, Dailies and Onset tools were developed based on that. And then currently, we're at the stage where we're bringing ACES and developing it along with color correction manufacturers and digital intermediate vendors. So for VFX and scanning, there was the idea to create a standard scanning interchange. And actually, the Academy accomplished that. There's the ADX10 and ADX16 standards. So now if you have a piece of film and bring it to Technicolor, Photochem, eFilm, any one of the many places that still do scanning, you can actually get really close scans, though that doesn't excite people anymore. But one of the core missions of ACES has actually already been solved. We have efficient interchange of density. Now, being able to look at those images, we've yet to fully standardize, but that's something important. And visual effects houses wanted a way to be able to interchange images. They have this great file format called EXR that was developed specifically for their industry. And it, essentially, you can think of it as a super raw format. It can hold ridiculous amounts of data, such as real luminance information of the sun, all the way to a shadow or anything that we see in this room. But even though it could hold all this information, what was defined in that file was different between each visual effects facility. One of the first steps of ACES was coming together and creating a standardized way where these files could be exchanged, and that's already done. So no one's really excited about that because that work's finished. Next came the camera manufacturers in the ASC. As film became less prominent, digital cinema cameras became more prominent, and the ASC, the American Society of Cinematographers, was very keen in making sure that as these new camera technologies developed, they were developed in such a way to help augment the artistic process as opposed to steamrolling over people who had previously used film. So, in that sense, there's still ongoing development and ongoing work with cam manufacturers and the ASC even now. We've got dailies and onset tools. Once you had these camera files, how do you look at them for dailies? Just currently, we, as a group, developed an onset look, an onset log format, and then we developed a way of communicating color from onset. Right now, we're currently in the development phase with color corrector manufacturers. We're making sure that the needs of DI are met while all of the promises of flexibility from ACES pipeline are there. So what are the promises? What's ACES going to do? What's it going to do for you? What's it going to do for everyone? ACES really delivers on the promise of raw workflows. If you can remember going to manufacturers' booths maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, and you're hearing how amazing the world was going to be when you had these raw workflows and these cameras that all shot everything, super native 4K, 8, 16, all this resolution, you're like, wow, it's going to be perfect. You're going to have all the sensor data. Well, in reality, once these workflows got into the real world, we fell back into the thing of proprietary formats. So ACES helps bring those files out of proprietary formats and move them along. It creates a consistent color pipeline that puts artistic control back at the beginning of the film, at the camera end, and then it simplifies color pipelines. So let's just a broad overview of an ACES workflow for a live action film. For Onset, if you were to use ACES today, you're simply going to record raw like you always do. You're going to use the proxy ACES or ACES proxy. I don't remember which we named it. Jim?
ACES proxy.
It's ACES proxy. Okay, for your onset monitoring, there's going to be a single LUT. You no longer need to know if you're shooting on Sony or Canon or ARRI or whichever, or Red or whatever the manufacturers. There's a single LUT that you can use for your onset monitoring to help simplify things. And you still have all of your onset look management tools available through ASC CDL. Once you've moved from offset, you can process all of your dailies using CDL and ACES look to bake in for editorial. And then EXR files are processed from the camera raw files that for the rest of the production for DI or for visual effects. Editorial currently is the weak link in the chain of ACES, and I'll get to that in a little bit as to why. But they basically have to use baked media, and they're not very affected by ACES at this point. Visual effects gains a large benefit if you're using ACES for your film. EXR files interchange between facilities. Facilities can talk to each other without having to exchange lookup tables and camera linearization tables. There's a very strong support of ACES inside the VFX community. And then what's also important is that because the look for ACES is known, they can start pre-visualization before DI house is picked. When you get to digital intermediate, the EXR files can be conformed directly from editorial, the same as you would any camera raw format. The better than EXR, better than raw fidelity you can get from EXR means that any color changes that were done along the pipeline can be backed out. Typically, when you have raw file format, you have to bake that to a lower dimension format, such as a DPX, to get from visual effects back into your DI. So you have an advantage there. And if all this sounds really familiar and boring, it's because it should be. All we're doing for this entire committee is looking at what's in practice and what makes sense from a digital production workflow and implementing sort of the best ideas from that. Where's this going next? Is where the ACES project is going next is archivists have been an ever-present part of the ACES development and sneakily quiet. So half of ACES is color. The other half of ACES is keeping track of the metadata, all that shoot, time, day, location, actor information that you need now that you're producing reams and reams and reams of this digital footage. So there's coming up with a standardized way to keep all of that information in a file, so it doesn't matter if you're using Red, the Red RAW, the Sony RAW, or something else. When you get into editorial, you're going to have one single place to look for that particular information. Of course, once we give it to the archivist, it's also going to editorial, and like anything that happens in Hollywood, the studios are going to have the last say. And before the ACES project is going to be finalized and approved everywhere, we will definitely have to address any studio concerns that they have before it's got the kiss of approval from everyone.
My name is Dave McClure. I'm with MTI Film, and we're one of many manufacturers at this point who have begun and actually gone very far in the process of implementing support for ACES within our software applications. You may know us as a company that provides a restoration tool or a Dailies tool known as Control Dailies. We just recently released our next product line, which is called Cortex, and it's a combination of a Dailies tool as well as a transcoding tool. And today, in a file-based world, a lot of what you do during Dailies is what I would call transcoding. That term can be debated a bit, but basically you're taking files of one format and converting them to another. And Joseph, I think, talked about two of these things that would happen during Dailies as far as the file conversions go. One is taking whatever raw codec you're working with and converting that to something like TNX HD for editorial if you're in an Avid, or ProRes if you're in Final Cut, as well as making OpenEXR files, which are the ACES specified file format that actually can hold the full dynamic range that the color encoding specification allows for. DNX HD and ProRes, on the other hand, really don't have the same bit depth. So as Joseph was talking about, the editorial room is really not looking at an ACES file. They're looking at something that has the color rendered into it. So they're at a lower bit depth, but those files are offline files. They're not going to be color decisions today shouldn't be made there anyway with those file formats. So you're not really in too deep a hole there. VFX who is actually making decisions about how the images are going to look, and then final color correction, that's the important place to have all of this extra data. And one of the, it started out as a film problem. I'm scanning film here, I'm scanning film there. How do I get them to look the same? But we have, in many ways, just as difficult a problem now, because what happened when film started going away and digital cameras became more and more popular and higher quality is that the number of formats that you have to deal with now has gone from, am I looking at 35 millimeter or 60 millimeter to what of 20 or 30 cameras, file formats, and codecs am I dealing with? So I think it's a nice thing that there's really two parts of this. There's a color encoding part and there's a file format part. And it's what ACES is doing, it is boring, but it's a standardization process. It's saying, how do I get from these various files into a common format so that you know that if you take a file and convert it at one facility or in one guy's garage or with one application and then you do it again in another application, you're getting the same results. And that's really a very important part of this. So the other important part is that workflows are changing. Different workflows are being enabled by these digital cameras, so different parts of what we had typically thought of as post-production are happening outside of post-production facilities now. Dailies are done on set, or part of your dailies are done on set, what dailies means to one person may be different to another, but you're going to be looking at images coming out of a camera, and the ACES group has put together a way to say, even though that video tap out of the camera is not 16-bit floating point, there's this thing called ACES Proxy, which if that transform's been defined so that when you make decisions using the ASC CDL parameters, another very successful standard that is carrying through the ACES project, you can take those decisions and apply them later downstream to that full floating point, high dynamic range data and get something that looks the same. You'll have more information there, but the look that you intended to create on set will be actually delivered to editorial the same way. And if you start your final color correction with your dailies color, you'll be starting at the same point. So it's taking a lot of the guessing game out of how do I make sure that what I looked at on set is what I'm going to be looking at in the cutting room is what I'm going to be looking at in post-production. Any good post-production facility would help manage this process at any time, but it's taking the special sauce out of it, and it's allowing different entities to work together in a common system. The archiving part of this is important not just for the metadata, but to have something that can go into a vault and you can say, I can read this file 20, 30 years later, and I know I'm looking at something that looks the way it should because the color encoding has been specified. So the standardization is a very important part of this. It's been a bit of a moving target as the rendering transforms have been scrutinized. You've got a lot of really smart people looking at these images and making sure that they're getting the best quality image that they can that comes out of it and that everyone's happy. There's a lot of people involved, whereas before, when you're in a single vendor world with one camera, they have their own transform, they have their own log format, they tell you how to go from that format to Rec 709 and they don't need to get anyone else's approval. You've got a lot of people looking at these things, and so it's taken time, but it is a really amazing effort. And one of the other cool things is that because the camera manufacturers are involved, many of them, anyway, have included within their SDKs or their codecs a way to say, decode this file in ACES. So they're already giving you the data in the color encoding that's been specified. For those cameras that haven't done this or won't do this because you never know, whether GoPro is going to get involved in this or something like that, there are ways of specifying and cataloging transforms that can be shared, and you can say, this is how you get from this format into ACES. So the first step is getting that camera file into an ACES color space, And that's what I'm showing you here. This is not an OpenEXR file. This is a raw file. And all I've done to put it into ACES is select the ACES drop-down menu in the decoding settings. You'll notice it looks very dark. Again, this is one of the things to be aware of, is where you look at the image matters. There's several transforms specified, so on a given monitor, you may not see something that looks reasonable without applying all of the transforms. Now, this is an acronym I don't think Joseph threw out yet, but there's something called ACES, the output color encoding space, and this is something you should never look at on a 10-bit monitor directly, but I just want to demonstrate it. I think it does show you that you're taking this, something that looks very dark, and it's getting, expanded well beyond what this monitor is capable of displaying, and we're just clipping everything off. But there's real data up there, so if I did crank down the lift knob, you would see that I actually am maintaining that detail through the process. So if, God forbid, you did render this into a file, it could actually be backed out, like Joseph said. Now, this is with the latest rendering transform and Rec 709 output device transform applied. And you have something that looks very pleasing right out of the gate. And that's the whole point of this. It's not the whole point. It's one of many points. But it's one really cool thing is that right from the start, you have an image that looks very pleasing, and you have this really wide space to apply your creative decisions in. And just to demonstrate a little bit further, this is just with different CDL values applied, so it works very similar to anything else that you're used to, using normal ASC CDL color correction to do your dailies, and to then take those to any other system that can apply them the same way. So it's really interesting. It's been fun for us to be involved, and it's not quite done yet, but I think that I think some people did raise their hands earlier when Joseph asked, have you ever worked on a project that has used ACES? And while it is a moving target, it is a viable solution today, so it is something that if you're very interested in doing, you can actually work with it today. There is one last point I want to make, which on this practical side of things, you could, in your workflow, actually generate the ACES files during your dailies process, and that may be the best thing to do. I'm taking all my raw camera formats, I'm making DNX36, and at the same time, I'm rendering everything to 4K OpenEXR files. Now, what you may have been confronted with, if any of you have gone to your favorite post and said, okay, I'm ready to do my next project in ACES, let's talk about the numbers, is they'll say, okay, well, you're used to, keeping your RED files or your Sony RAW files or something else on your drive archived, and they're compressed already. So you have a certain idea in mind of how many bits do I need to allocate, or how many drives do I need, what's the storage space required for all of my original material. And now, if I create these ACES files, I'm generating a lot of data. And just consider the fact that those files don't need to be generated during dailies. So there are multiple paths to doing this. Again, there's the color encoding part of ACES, there's the file format part, and if you wanted to generate a master in ACES, and you want to do your mastering in ACES, that part could be, that conversion from your raw codec to your ACES files could be done when you get to final color correction or your post-production. Again, the editors don't need OpenEXR files, so you can make DNX36, and the whole point of this is that you have an audit trail and a specified way that you've done this color management, so you can do it again later and make those large files. It's still a process, but it's not a strict requirement that every single frame that you shot becomes an OpenEXR file that's taking up space. So something to consider just on the practical side of things.
We've been working on this project a long time, so we've had a lot of iterations and testing and development of ideas. We had discussions that lasted a year or two just on basic philosophies and things that we wanted to preserve. So But where we are now is about a year ago, we have our first public release was in March of last year, and that was 0.1.1. It was going to be 0.1, but we immediately realized we made a mistake, and so we had to go to a .1.1 to fix some things. So typical type of development project. And that system has been in a trial mode for lots of folks for this entire year. So we've slowly picked up folks who have tried it out. And to our surprise, because once it starts getting built into the vendor's software, it's just a menu item. And you're putting in a LUT or you're clicking a menu, and all of a sudden you're working in the ACES mode. And as a result of that, we now know that there's probably over 100 productions who have completed an ACES project. Some of them are DIs, some of them are television shows. We actually, because so many television shows last fall were using ACES, we were awarded a Emmy by the Television Academy. So we had an engineering Emmy for our contribution to making television programs better, which surprised us to some degree, but it's always fun to have everybody who does this kind of work benefit from what we were working on. So, and we're coming up now in the next month on our point 2 release of ACES, which is a upgrade and enhancements that we've been working on and fixing all the comments we got from all these productions who have been using it the past year, because there were some who had problems with it or didn't like certain aspects of it. Some of what we do is not as much science and is a little bit more art, so we have to sort of navigate the waters between the art and the science and satisfy all of our clients. And so comments we were working on more recently, we're trying to address some of those. And that release will be going out to vendors here shortly, and then will show up in products throughout the summer, I would expect. So I think our goals are now to move out of sort of the trial period and get more people who can rely on it on an ongoing basis and put it into sustained production. And this is happening so rapidly for us that once it's a menu item, we'll never know what people used it for or if it worked or didn't, because you can go into Resolve and just turn on ACES, or you can go into the Red software and export ACES, or the Sony F65 camera will have a pull-down menu that says go into ACES output on the video tap. And so all of those things are coming into fruition now. And we've been working with a lot of these vendors for a couple of years to get that to happen. So they've been coming to our meetings. They've gotten all of our design documents. So this is a very long-running process for the development of this stuff. And now we're sort of going out there and showing people the new things and trying to we have one more round of listening and getting feedback of what's working really well and what still needs some effort. And we've already had some comments from colorists that, again, talking about the art side, the colorists look at what they try to do, and they have comments about how they like to work or what they'd like to see, and we have to deal with those. So, because we do want this system to last for a long time. We went into this knowing that this wasn't going to be a quick product. We don't need to make money on this. This is all volunteer effort. It's putting stuff into the SMPTE standard community. It's an open source project, almost everything we do. So we really were just trying to do this for the benefit the benefit of the entire industry, and maintaining and getting back to the level of quality that we felt we had with the whole film chain. Because it was an obvious thing when we started this probably 2005, that all these digital systems were coming along and the digital cameras, and there was a real feel that we were losing some qualities that we had from the 70 years of film development, and we wanted to get those back. And so ACES, we maintain and still have the concept of a negative and a print. So the ACES files themselves are equivalent to a negative. It's a fully interchangeable digital file that has 33 stops of range and tons of latitude. And if your camera can ever do 33 stops, which they can't, but if they can, it's going to be stored yet. And then we have our print equivalent, which is the RRT or the viewing LUT, the ACES viewing LUT. It's going to have several names, but that's our print equivalent. It is a way to render this for a projector or for a monitor to make it look pretty good to start with. And then from there, you do your colorist tweaks and apply ASC, CDL, or other LUTs. You know, we have other, you can do all of those standard colorist tricks. You can use a day for night LUT or a bleach bypass, or all of those things can still be put in the system, just as we've been doing for ever since the digital color correctors got out there.
Okay, well, in 2009, the ASC put together something that we called the Camera Assessment Series, which was a way to do a side-by-side and round-robin comparison of all of the then current high-end digital cinema cameras. Maybe you'll help me out with this. I think there was ARRI at the time, D21. We had the Panavision Genesis. We had the Panasonic 3700. We had Sony F23, Sony F35. We had Red, we had Viper, and we had Film. Did I hit them all? And what we learned from doing the Camera Assessment Series was kind of an eye-opener to everyone in the community, mostly from the standpoint of workflow, because once we had done the tests over the course of a couple of days on a weekend in January, we took it to a lab in Hollywood, and it took us fully a month to conform a timeline that made any sense for all of the cameras. So at the time, the secret sauce of every lab was their input device transforms for all of the cameras to get them into a working 10-bit log environment in order to do color correction for output to film or digital cinema. And so if the lab that you were working with owned a LUT for, an input LUT for the Genesis, for example, you were happy as could be. And if they didn't own a LUT for the Viper, for example, then it made life very, very difficult. And if you tried to mix any of those two cameras, then the lab had to either own all the LUTs or develop them. And nobody shared anything because this was all hard work, very proprietary, and it was the secret sauce of every lab. So it was your, as a lab, it was your leg up on the competition to be able to handle this camera or that camera where someone else couldn't. So the work of conforming a timeline out of all of these disparate cameras and film that made any sense and got us at least into the starting point for color correction was about 5 weeks' work. And we had to pull and tug on every camera, and several of the cameras, we had to rewrite the input LUTs for them, and one or two of the cameras, we just never really got there because the lab just didn't own all of the color science to get every camera into a working conformed timeline. So with that lesson in mind, a couple of years later, we decided to set out and do another assessment that would consider all of the new cameras that had come out, the next generation of cameras that we hadn't tested in 2009, Red Epic, ARRI Alexa, the new Sony F65, the Sony F3, some new film stocks. So we set about doing a couple of tests that were a little more story-oriented and a little more filmic. And one of the complaints that we had from everybody about the first camera assessment series is that we didn't do anything in 4K. And at the time, sort of the de facto working environment for motion picture production was 2K anyway. But we set out to do the next test, the ICAS, in 4K and in the ACES color space. And so that you know, ACES is resolution independent, so you can plug anything into it and you can work at any resolution you want inside of ACES. Image Control Assessment Series was produced in collaboration with the Producers Guild for a previous Produced By conference. And it was really a practical study in not only new cameras, but in next generation workflow to employ ACES for a real world production scenario. And it was taking the new Ferrari out for a test drive. we designed two scenes. There was a day scene and a night scene. The day scene was deliberately shot in as open full sunlight as we could make it. And it's an interior-exterior scene. So you've got deep shadows inside, bright sunlight outside. And then the night scene had every combination of stressful photographic scenarios that we could jam into one scene. We had a sparkler, we had deep blacks, we had lightning flashes, we had headlights straight into the lens, we had color, we had detail, we had firelight, and the scenes were designed really to stress every camera in both highlight and in dark, in color reproduction, in resolution, all of the parameters that go into building cameras.
So the one thing we didn't really get into on set was, because we were trying to simplify things a little bit, is we didn't do any on-set color management. So we weren't trying to use ASC CDL and trying to have the DP set their look on set. We were just going out almost like a film shoot, but we didn't want to deal with the on-set preview or having everybody go to a video village and look at stuff. It was more or less, we did have some monitors, but they were just set up in 709. So then when we got to post, that's when we really kicked into using the whole ACES workflow. So every camera was converted into the ACES file. We put it on a baselite timeline. So it was all conformed, and the selects were made and put onto the baselite. And then we turned on the ACES LUT and looked at everything. And, it's going to be shocking, but when you see this stuff, what you see here is about 95% of what it looked like in Dailies. There were very small changes made later. We added a little warmth to the daylight stuff. We tweaked the colors slightly in a couple of the nighttime shots. But for the most part, there's a couple cameras here I can tell you were not touched at all from what the RRT look was. So the basic ACES LUT was just used, and we didn't make any colorist changes whatsoever. So, and you'll also notice, look for the things that are different. So with the IDT, where every camera gets calibrated to the ACES standard, every manufacturer did their own. Some of them were done really great, and some of them were kind of a first try. So you can see some differences in these systems, but compared to some of our old camera tests, where every camera was like in a different universe, this one you'll see right away, we didn't have to do a lot of amazing work to get these cameras to come to where they're at. You can find differences when you're looking at certain colors. I mean, in the night shot, look at the motorcycle in the background. That'll show some difference.
The color of the gas tank is really interesting to watch.
Yeah, so stuff like that. So there are things you'll pick up, but mostly this proved and it was our really first multi-camera test where we had all these cameras and film and ran them all through ACES and saw that our goals for the system really were satisfied. Was we brought stuff into the same universe, it made it easy for the colors to work with, and they got some real advantages in maintaining the dynamic range of all the individual cameras, both for shadow detail and highlights.
There's a really interesting kind of funny anecdotal story about bringing the stuff into the timeline and turning ACES on for each of the cameras. We color graded this material at Sony, and I kind of, maybe I shouldn't have, but I sneaked into the back of the room unannounced and just sort of watched them finishing the assembly of the timeline. And when they turned on ACES and just looked at and scrubbed through the timeline, the first time, everything came up almost like you see it here, as Jim said. And after the colorist scrubbed through the timeline, he turned to his assistant and he said, "Oh, hell, there goes my job."
Well, at least
not really. I mean, it just frees them up to do the creative work sooner in the process, actually. Gary Demos, color scientist in town, showed me something really, really amazing from some Arri Alexa images that he had color corrected in an ACES environment. He managed to obtain from Aeroflex some Alexa images of the last shuttle takeoff. And you know what it's like to look at the engines, the rocket engines of the shuttle. Those things are just always flatlined on a waveform vector scope, and they're clipped, and that's it. And that's all you're ever going to get out of them if you've got a nominal exposure for the vehicle itself. But in an ACES environment, he took the gain wheel and just started dialing it down and dialing it down and dialing it down. And somewhere between 5, 6, and 7 stops, the sky was almost completely dark and the rocket was almost completely dark, but the engines snapped into view and you could see detail in the flames of the rocket engines. So I tried to reproduce that same color correction in a 10-bit log color corrector a few weeks later with the same material in DPX format as opposed to the ARRI RAW. And those clipped highlights just stayed clipped and dropped down the waveform vector scope. So the value of ACES as a color correction tool is going to give us astronomical new possibilities. I mean, I'm convinced of that from the experiment with the rocket engines.
Yes, I mean, the key thing is that you don't have to stay in RAW to get everything that the camera gave you. So, as Joseph said earlier, we don't think you have to go right out of, when you record this stuff and go right to ACES. You can save it till the very end. And like when you're doing a pull for a DI or a final a TV show, you're only going to pull less than 5% of the material you shot anyway, as the editors do the conform. So that's the point at which normally you would turn this stuff into ACES. But at that point, you're not losing anything from what was in your original raw files. And more importantly, you don't have to do, at least not in the processing stage, you don't have to do what you often have to do with Red, for example, or Alexa as well, where you change the white balance, and then you say, okay, this was shot at 3200, so I'm going to re-render my files out, and then you say, oh, wait, it's still clipping. I guess I got to change it to 2800, so then you re-render again. So you're always doing these parameter tests in the Red software to get the best image out, so when you go out to grade, you have that. ACES gets rid of that path, because everything that you had in your original RAW file is captured in the ACES file. So you can manipulate color balance to your heart's content. I mean, in the daylight shots here, we were in that sort of hazy blue conditions that you get in Southern California, right? The skies were not really blue, not really overcast. They weren't clouds, but it was just kind of a hazy blue. And the renders that you see, because the brightness of the sky was up there, that just comes out as sort of a white. It doesn't have much detail. But if I took all those shots down 2 or 3 stops, all the blue skies come back exactly as they were the day we shot them. So if you wanted to power window that, we tried that, and we were playing with color correction, doing windows, and we could have brought the blue skies back in half the shots, and in other shots, there was clouds going through, so we kind of said, let's just leave them all alone so we could say we didn't have to use any power windows. But we did play with that for a while and said everything that was in there, we could pull out cloud detail, we could pull out lights, we could pull out the detail on the headlights on the motorcycle, the little crystal patterns in front of the light. We could dial the stuff down and we could pull that stuff out again, which you just don't see in video cameras. That's not something you can normally do.
Well, ACES is unambiguous. So if we can get people to do entire shows in EXR and ACES, then you won't be in the color Tower of Babel anymore. After the last show that I did as a visual effects supervisor and stereographer, the number of shots that we got from different vendors on different continents was huge. And it made me really quickly realize that color science is really actually a hobby in most of the visual effects community, not a science, because we were getting back things that were just so all over the map that even though we had written a color procedure document, every artist knows where a few of the buttons are, and not every artist knows what all of them do, and the stuff that you get back is just generally a mess in terms of color science.
I mean, I was the color scientist for ImageWorks for 6 years. So, I mean, it was, as part of the thing, as visual effects went international, it was really important to have like strong color science when you're farming out to 4 or 5 different facilities, and you realize that you're farming out to them because they have the best price. They're farming out to other people. So you can easily have 70, 100 facilities involved on a film, even though, for instance, you're only working with one studio. So sort of this type of consistency really required, at a certain point, having color scientists when you literally have shots coming in from 100 different places, and you can't tell your subcontractors who they can't subcontract to. So in this case, having a specification on how EXRs are viewed is pretty valuable.
Well, I think people will get on board as they see the advantages of it. I mean, we're not trying to mandate anything. We're just saying, hey, here's what we think are best practices to maintain the highest quality level and to give you the most flexibility in production. So to the extent that we've succeeded at that, then I think people are just going to naturally find a fit when they start trying this stuff in ACES. I mean, there are definitely workflows and circumstances where ACES isn't the right solution. So, and we're not trying to think that this is a monolithic thing that everybody must use, because there will be cases where people will decide, for their own reasons, hey, I'm going to do it this way. And an example of that might be, shooting GoPros while mountain climbing and editing on your laptop at 12,000 feet. I mean, that's probably not the best place where you would really need to have ACES, because you're not looking at digital projection. You don't need the high dynamic range. You're just trying to tell a simple story as almost a one-man shooter and editor putting a thing together. And so, I think for the places where it does make sense is, interaction with lots of visual effects vendors and things where you really are pushing the photography, where you're using lots of different cameras. You're shooting film and IMAX and digital cameras and GoPros, and there's a show up in San Francisco I heard about right now that's shooting with 50 cameras. They have 25 of them are GoPros. They have 9 Alexas. They have Reds. They have and that's custom fit for the benefits that ACES really gives you. Because at the end of the day, we're not doing anything different than the print industry already did. They came up with their ICC profiles to calibrate all the scanners and the printers and the monitors so that you could do graphics art workflows and everybody could interchange files and this stuff would all work. And the motion picture industry never had that. So we said, it's about time. We need a color management workflow. We also want some other things. We wanted high dynamic range file formats, because 10 bits is not enough, and we never thought it was. The Cineon system, even Kodak said, well, 10 bits isn't enough, but that's all we can afford to do right now. And so we wanted more bits, and we wanted higher dynamic range and wider color gamuts. We wanted to allow for higher resolution. I mean, we don't do anything special about that. It's just that if you want to pack more in there, because your camera can do it, we should be able to support those things. We also want to future-proof things so that if you're making changes to the data, you're not being destructive. So think of it this way. With the Kodak system, we had about 90 code values per stop. And you could print that up and down, and you could change the contrast. And Cineon maintained its consistency with that, so everything was pretty good. But there were times when you could push it a little too far and things would break apart. So in the ACES system, we have over 1,000 code values per stop. So we have much finer gradation. We can deal with very low noise cameras or film systems that have lots of grain. And we preserve everything that's there without destruction. So if you want to go back and pull this out later, say we get 25 stop displays 15 years from now, we've already shown this, is we've taken this footage and we've put it on the Dolby displays, which have a 600 nit or even a 4,000 nit range, which is 12x and 40x current display technologies. And we just put it on there without doing any color timing at all, and the stuff looks amazing. I mean, Dolby's very active recently with us because of the benefits of some of the things that we did in this area. So by having your original negative retain all of that range that was originally shot, you're going to be able to keep using this stuff for a very long time. I mean, we weren't thinking in the short term here, let's just get something out for this decade. We were thinking, it's taken us a decade to do this. We want this to last 50 years. We want archives 100 years from now to be able to pull up these files and say, oh, I know what this is. It's all in the ACES format. We know exactly what that is. We know how to use it. There's nothing about that that's a problem. Because to us, we wanted a digital system that replaced the 35 millimeter film negative. Because even today, you can take the negatives and ship them off and get prints made and put them up on printers and do all that. And in the digital file-based workflows, there's nothing that works that way. So we wanted this file format and this philosophy of how you do production to be that consistency for the long term. And that's why, you know, we're advocating this as not like, you know, some of the projects that have been done were not 100% kosher ACES. You know, there's plenty of projects that said, well, I'm just going to use the color management part for the scanners and recorders. So they scanned it in ADX, and then they color timed the normal DI way, and then they filmed it out on an ARRI using the calibration that we came up with for the ARRIs. And that's fine. You know, as long as you're following these general principles, you're going to give the same benefits of having these consistent color-managed files that people can work with. And, you know, the same thing happens with Onset, as we have people working in Rec 709, or we have colorists who only want to do Rec 709 on the projector so that they can then ship that to multiple places that both do digital cinema or HDTV. And that's fine as well, because we can go from the inverse of this. We know what colors they asked for, and we can turn it backwards into our system and say, what color would you put into an ACES file that's going to give you that? Because there's only one version. I mean, every color we have in a file only has one output color that it can produce. So we can always go backwards. We can go either way. So, and that was really a key, the invertibility thing that Dave asked about, is that was a key design point for us, was we wanted to be able to go back and forth to allow all of these things. Pixar specifically requested that. They said, you know, we're going to render our super colorful animated cartoons to whatever color space we want. And we don't need ACES because we're not using cameras, but we want to use it for the archive side. So they wanted the same thing. We'll invert what we make into ACES, so we have a high dynamic range cartoon master that has super brilliant color in it. And that's their plan of how they would use the ACES system. And we think that's a benefit all by itself. We have a recommended practices document for IDTs that has 4 different methods that you can use to make IDTs. The simplest is using a color chart that has 28 different chips, and you sort of create an average 3x3 matrix that would make all those colors turn out right. And that's the simplest, easiest to execute, and probably the least accurate. There's other methods we've looked at where you can take all the spectral measurements of every patch. You can do 200 patches, or you can sample the spectral sensitivity of your camera in like every 10 nanometer slices and calculate from that. You can use math that's above and beyond a 3x3 matrix. You could use one where you have what you would call a 3x10 polynomial, and there's lots of these different terms, and you would average them all together to get a result. So we tried all these different methods, and we do find that the basic method works pretty well in almost all circumstances. So a simple tone curve to make it linear, a 3x3 matrix to get it into the right primaries or get the right average, gives a decent result. But I can tell you that some camera manufacturers, I won't name names, but one of them created 8,000 spectral samples. And they sampled 10 of their cameras with all 8,000 spectral samples, and then run a program to come up with what they considered to be the best IDT that would represent that camera. And their results are really good. When you look at what is shot on scene and what you see up there, you're like, okay, that's almost the best job I've seen to date. And then there are other guys who made an IDT by using a Macbeth chart, and it worked, but is it perfect? No, there's lots of areas where it falls apart. So it's a matter of how much effort you want to put into it, and the learning curve for the engineers who do that work, who are almost always the camera engineers or people working with the cameras closely, who will decide, this is the level I'm going to go to make my IDT the best it can be.
It's going to depend on whether that camera manufacturer has natively supplied this IDT in their SDK, in which case it's very easy, or if you need to import some lookup table to apply the IDT. That's the 2 ways that we support it today. We also support, which is kind of interesting, the ability to import directly the CTL files that and this is a color transform language that the ACES group is working with to design these different transforms. And it's not an optimized language. It's really built for, having all the tools at the developer's disposal to get the colors right. So it's not practical to run it in real time through CTL, but what we do is if you import the CTL files, then we build a very large 3D lookup table. It's 65 cubed, and you give it the range that you want to target, and it does a best fit approximation that's very, very accurate, actually, and then you have that 3D lookup table going forward. So, we can build the LUTs, but also the users can directly, if they have access to those CTL files, load them directly. So there's a number of ways to use the software to get the results that you want.
We've done a number of ACES projects at this point where we've used our NextLab Live system to do onset live color correction and then carry that all the way through to our various color correction systems. But one of the things that I think should be noted is that people talk about this concept of a kosher ACES or a full ACES, and I really liked it when the terminology was image interchange framework, where what you would do is you would use the parts of this system that make sense for your production practically, and you can use just those parts and then use a traditional production workflow to fill in the pieces that you feel aren't ready or don't meet your needs, instead of going, well, I really like this camera transform and the rest of it doesn't work. You don't have to do that. Like, we have 2 projects that are in right now where they're animated projects that did their initial visual development in P3 and then switched to an ACES pipeline after. So in the sense of we can support ACES at every point along the way from camera to DI, but we can also work in mixed workflows so that you can just use it for the parts that you've needed it on.
But as far as community education goes and when people start a project and they think, hey, should I use ACES for this? That's the kind of question that people are able to ask at this point, that everyone's able to ask, is, should I do this in ACES? Or even better or worse is, I want to do this in ACES. And since there are many different pieces, I think the next stage is, which benefits do you want from ACES? What's important to you? Is it having an ACES master to go into the archive so that you're not dealing with this problem 10 years later of which IDTs do I or don't I have? Let's deal with that now and make an ACES master. Or is it just, I want to use the color management system? I'm doing a television show and it's HD today, and all I want is just to use these basically transforms or lookup tables that have had this level of scrutiny so that I know I have a very well-defined color management from end to end. But I don't really need an ACES master in any vault, or the people backing me are not going to pay for that, so I can't do that. And that's where I think things need to head next, is what parts of this framework are important to you.
One of our goals is to try to make things look as close as we can to what we consider our reference, which is the digital cinema projectors with P3. And you can't always do that because there's a lot of different circumstances. So in video in particular, you have a bright display at 400 nits in a bright room, or is it a dark room? And all of those affect the way you see images. So right now we have 9 different ODTs. We have one for P3. We have one for XYZ on the digital cinema projector. And the other 7 are all variants of this video problem of how do we show Rec 709 or sRGB at D60 or D65 for a Dolby monitor or for a regular monitor, for an OLED, there's a whole lot of considerations. So our ODTs in the general are specific to devices, and we try to map the colors in our rendered version as close as we can get on those devices. But the thing that there's no, I'd say, known solution for in the industry or even for us is the tricky questions of gamut mapping. When we have certain colors that we want to show on Rec 709, they just don't fit. Or if you try to put them in there, it makes like all the reds crunch up and you get these flat bands of red, even though that's supposed to be 20 different colors of red. And so that's why this is like a full-time employment for colorist problem, because you'll still need trim passes for the colorist to say, yeah, my red's here too much. I got to pull this in a little bit, or I got to desaturate this a little, or push this one out a little bit more to make the video version look as good or better than the cinema reference. So, we don't have an automatic one-touch-fits-all solution where you just say, turn this on, and then everything's perfect. We'd like to have that, and we still do R&D to find better methods, but we don't have that solution. So what we're doing now is our best approximation ODTs in the different circumstances of Rec. 709 and lay out, here's what this one's for. Use it this way if you want the best results. So we have an Onset version that is designed to match this projector in an Onset monitor. So it has the same color white point, it has the same color response as best as we can. The 709 or a P3 monitor, a lot of the monitors can be switched into P3 these days. So, we have those ODTs and those LUTs for those. But that's why when you get into the ODT land, you have to look at what is it I want to do, and what does this ODT that I got say it's for, and then match up those requirements.
When I was hearing the description of ACES, I was hearing that it's going to benefit these large VFX multi-vendor shows. And what we've actually been finding, and the reason that we were so surprised to find out that hundreds of projects is finished in ACES, is that the big projects aren't using ACES because they get people like us. They can have any, of $200 million budget film can get any color expert or the best color experts in the industry. Smaller films, smaller indie productions, that one person with a GoPro on the mountain are beginning to use ACES because they don't understand everything, and it works well enough today that they can use the ACES transform for their camera, use the ACES transform in Resolve, and then be able to actually go through and do their whole production without having to know all of the esoteric different camera settings and all of the esoteric finishing settings. So it's actually a bigger benefit for the smaller productions.